Today, we're diving into something really important, a crisis that's been quietly unfolding in India's education system: student suicide. We're going to go way beyond the headlines to really unpack the staggering numbers, expose the deep-rooted causes, and then look at a landmark legal response that is trying to change the future for millions of students.
13,000. Let that number sink in for a second. This isn't just a statistic, it's our starting point. According to the National Crime Records Bureau, that's how many students died by suicide in India in 2022 alone. Every single one of those represents a huge loss, and it points to something deeply troubling going on.
You know, numbers like that are exactly why India's own Supreme Court has called this a suicide epidemic. This isn't some new issue. It's a crisis that has been building for years, a kind of silent epidemic that has finally reached a boiling point where a national response is the only option.
But that pressure, it's not the same everywhere. If you look at a place like Kota, which is famous as India's coaching hub, the crisis is just off the charts. In 2023, the student suicide rate there was a shocking 20.5 per 100,000. That is more than 4 times the national average. It just goes to show how these super high-stakes environments can become these tragic centers of despair.
But to really get what's going on here, we have to look deeper. This isn't just about passing exams, you know? It's really a crisis of aspiration, where this immense pressure to succeed is constantly colliding with some pretty major systemic failures. The Supreme Court used this really powerful metaphor to get to the heart of the problem. They said the suicides we see are just the visible tip of a massive iceberg. So that begs the question, right? What in the world is lurking beneath the surface?
Well, here are the submerged parts of that iceberg. It's this whole complicated mix of things. You've got intense academic pressure, of course, but also pervasive caste-based discrimination, crushing financial hardship, and just plain institutional apathy. Add in things like ragging, bullying, and a serious lack of mental health support, and you can see why the court sees these as systemic problems, not just individual failures.
And look, this lack of support isn't just a feeling people have. The data is pretty damning. A National Task Force survey, which was appointed by the Supreme Court, found that a whopping 65% of the higher education institutions they surveyed had absolutely zero mental health service providers, and 73% didn't have any full-time professionals. The support system just, it wasn't there.
And if you want to know just how deep the neglect really goes, get this. Out of more than 60,000 institutions in the country, only 3.5% even bothered to respond to the task force's survey. The Supreme Court was, as you can imagine, deeply disappointed, calling it an apathetic attitude that was basically a huge roadblock to any real change.
So, this institutional failure, it's exactly what forced the Supreme Court to step in, triggering a landmark legal action that has now basically put the entire education system on notice.
The catalyst for all this was a case called Amit Kumar versus the Union of India. It all started with the heartbreaking deaths of 2 students at the prestigious IIT Delhi. Their families alleged that caste-based discrimination played a role, but the police initially just dismissed their complaints after a quick look. This case, though, was about to set a whole new precedent.
And the court's ruling here? It was a total game changer. It mandated that in any case of an unnatural death on campus, the police must register a First Information Report, or an FIR, immediately. This is huge because it takes away the police's ability to do a preliminary inquiry and then decide not to investigate. It's a critical step toward ensuring accountability, especially when things like discrimination are being alleged.
What's amazing here is just how quickly the judiciary moved on this. In March 2025, the court sees this disturbing pattern and forms the National Task Force. By the end of that same year, the task force delivers its bombshell report. And then, just a few weeks later, in January 2026, the Supreme Court issues these sweeping, nationwide directives to build a new protective architecture for students.
So, what does this new architecture of safeguards actually look like? Well, it represents a pretty fundamental shift in how institutions are now expected to take care of their students.
The change is just fundamental. We're moving from a culture that blames individuals to one of institutional accountability. We're going from quiet internal committees to mandatory police investigations, from optional support services to safeguards that can actually be enforced, and from institutional silence to annual public reporting. It's a complete overhaul of the old way of doing things.
Okay, so among all the new rules, 4 of them really stand out as critical. First, mandatory and immediate police reporting of any unnatural death. Second, clearing all pending scholarship payments within 4 months. That's huge for relieving financial stress.
Third, filling all vacant faculty positions to reduce academic pressure. And fourth, making sure every residential campus has 24/7 access to medical help.
And it's not just universities. The court's intervention is also hitting the massive, multi-billion-dollar coaching industry. New rules now mandate counseling systems, they prohibit glorifying toppers, which just adds to the pressure, and they require formal complaint systems. And crucially, these rules have teeth. There's steep financial penalties and even the threat of losing their registration if they don't comply.
So all these new rules are creating a safety net, which is so needed. But the real road to recovery, that requires more than just regulations. It requires building an entirely new culture of support.
The path forward is really all about being proactive. This means integrating mental wellness into daily school life, like what's laid out in the government's UMED guidelines. It means using tiered prevention frameworks, from universal support that helps all students to more specific support for those in crisis. And maybe most importantly, it means shifting the very definition of success away from just grades and toward a more holistic sense of well-being.
And all of this brings us to the final, really crucial question. The Supreme Court's directives have mandated a new era of safety and accountability, but rules can only do so much, right? What will it actually take for institutions, for teachers, for parents, and for students themselves to build a genuine culture of support, one where asking for help is encouraged and where well-being is valued just as much as any grade? That, really, is the ultimate challenge.